Right, now we're on to the source question, and the key word that you should have included in your answer is success. You're not being asked how useful the source is generally, you're being asked for an inquiry into the success of King's campaign in the north. This source, source D, suggests that there was some success, because things like the city had to admit there was in fact segregation in Chicago, whereas this source, summed up by that word there, failed in Chicago. You've got to look at the both sources, and of course in a how useful question, the easiest thing to do if you've revised is check what this says against what's in your head, and the same for this one. And actually all the knowledge here applies to either of the sources. So that one says the white community reacted negatively. Well, if you'd watched GCSE Pod, you know that gun sales soared during the riots. And also in Chicago specifically, Martin Luther King was hit by a brick in one of the marches, which really shocked him, which, this white community generally had supported the civil rights movement when it had been down in the South. It also suggests that the mayor, there was some success because the mayor had to admit that there was segregation. But what it doesn't say is that the mayor, who was called Daley, encouraged integration, but didn't actually do anything about it. He said, we should be integrated, but there was words, but not many actions. This one, suggesting that there was complete failure, well, it might bring into, there's other knowledge, some of this would count, but yeah, the people in the north, the people in Chicago, of Martin Luther King saying that things had to change and that things had to be more equal economically, well, yeah, they called him a communist, and it undermined him because at the time the Cold War was a huge thing in America, and the Vietnam War was kicking off by this point. So the second one, based on knowledge, this one is more closely aligned to the facts, to history as I know it from my own knowledge, which makes up, based on the knowledge, this a more useful source. But of course you've got to take into account both things. And you can look at the provenance to help you to explain why this might be a useful source and why this might not be so much. And it's this bit. This was the group that invited Martin Luther King. So this guy, Albert Raby, might be over-exaggerating the success that the Chicago movement had, because he was part of the group that was responsible for inviting Martin Luther King along, causing all this. So he might be wanting to justify those actions and the things that happened in the civil rights movement because he was directly involved. And this guy, it doesn't say that he invited Martin Luther King or even that he was necessarily there. It kind of implies it. But he seems to be able to look back and reflect that, yeah, it didn't really fail. So perhaps it's because he is less directly involved in the failure, feels less responsible for the failure than he does. Some of you might go on about, it's many years later and they've forgotten. That's quite simplistic. It would have been better to talk about him being more directly involved. You could say, many years later, he's looking back and the whole of the civil rights movement was a success, so maybe he's sugarcoating how this was in his mind and when it wasn't in reality much of a success. But it's got to be a combination of this bit, the provenance of the source at the top, and the content of the source against your own knowledge. So that's the how useful question, and specifically look at whether you've used this word success in your answer. Now then, I'm going to whip through this because it's a 4 marker. Interpretation 1 suggests that they're looking at progress in the civil rights movement, says there was no progress or very little progress, and you had a quote. 1 sentence, 2 sentence. Second says there was progress, add a quote. 4 sentences, 4 marks, job done. For this one, suggest one reason why they give different views. Well, you can always say this, they probably used different sources of evidence and came to different conclusions. That'll get you some marks. Having looked at a lot of example answers, the way to go about this is you say, well, interpretation 1, as you can see here, it focuses on economic issues, distribution of the nation's wealth. Interpretation 2 focuses on other aspects like politics. It talks about officials, elected officials, and elections and politics specifically there. So one's focusing on that aspect, the other one's focusing on a different aspect, therefore they probably used different sources and came to different conclusions. 4 marks out of 4. And now to the biggie. The interpretations and how far you agree with the interpretations. There were actually 2 GCSE pods on the extent of progress in the civil rights movement by the mid-1970s. So if this was really like something you were lost on, that'd probably be best your first port of call to find them on GCSE pod. As I've already said, this one suggests not much progress, and this one suggests progress. So the whole point of this is you pick out things the interpretations say and judge them against your own knowledge as to whether they're right or not. And so what you need is information that there was progress to help you assess, confirm that one or deny that one, and evidence that there wasn't any progress to criticise these 2. And it's asking you how far do you agree with interpretation 1. So this has got to be your basis of what you're writing about. And you might decide, I disagree with interpretation 1, I agree with interpretation 1, doesn't matter. And you have a paragraph of all the reasons why somebody might agree with what is being said here. This stuff, there wasn't much progress. Well, there was race riots. This will tell you, there was 225 of them between 1964 and 68. There was police brutality. 54 people died in 1 week of rioting, and this time there was millions of dollars of damage. The Kerner report, which was brought out to investigate the lack of progress and all of the race riots that were going on, was completely ignored by President Nixon, and the Kerner report itself confirmed that there hadn't been enough progress in this time, all confirming that perhaps, yes, there wasn't much progress, especially in economic issues. And then you can say, well, I might, on the other hand, you could disagree with this interpretation, and the things that are said in interpretation 2 could help you with that, because of course you've got to mention both interpretations. So what evidence is there that there was progress and that this was wrong? Well, there had been progress because there'd been an outlaw in things like discrimination for colour of skin with Jim Crow laws, with the Civil Rights Act. And there'd also been the Voting Rights Act, so it was totally against the law, and there was things in place to stop discrimination against people in voting rights because of the colour of their skin. There had been integration, like with the Civil Rights Act, the ending of the Jim Crow laws, and the fact that there was this Kerner report, that was ordered to happen by the President. The President was taking an interest in this. The key most powerful people in the country were trying to do something about the lack of progress. That in itself is progress. And of course there was an increase in, this is from the GCSE pod, an increase in black elected officials from 10.9% to 15.1% after these things up until 1975. In particular, that you could talk about Shirley Chisholm, who was the first black woman elected to Congress. So there's evidence that there was some progress at this time that would help you potentially to disagree with interpretation 1 before you come to your conclusion at the end of just the extent of how much you agree with interpretation 1. So, progress would be the word that would come up in your answer time and time again. If you